I never thought my retirement dream would involve fighting off a homeowners association over my bison herd. But there I was on a Tuesday morning, staring at a certified letter that threatened to fine me $10,000 for keeping dangerous livestock on my 5-acre property outside Bozeman, Montana. My name is Ethan Gallagher, and I had spent 30 years working construction in Seattle before finally saving enough to buy land in Big Sky country. The property was perfect, rolling grassland with the Bridger Mountains visible in the distance, a sturdy fence that the previous owner had used for cattle, and enough space that my nearest neighbor was almost a quarter-mile away. I purchased 6 American bison from a reputable breeder, all females, all docile as dairy cows. They were my pride and joy, grazing peacefully and living the life that bison were meant to live before we nearly wiped them off the continent. The letter came from Deborah Patterson, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I had known about the HOA when I bought the place, but the realtor assured me it was mostly concerned with keeping people from painting their houses neon colors or leaving broken cars in their driveways. The covenants mentioned livestock restrictions, but they specifically exempted properties over 2 acres and made no distinction between cattle, horses, or any other large animals. I had done my homework. I'd consulted with a real estate attorney before closing. My bison were legal. Apparently, Deborah disagreed. I read the letter 3 times, my coffee growing cold on the kitchen table. The language was formal and threatening, citing section after section of HOA rules that I had never seen in my original documents. According to Deborah, bison were classified as exotic and dangerous animals, equivalent to keeping lions or bears. The letter demanded I remove them within 14 days or face daily fines starting at $500 and escalating from there. I picked up my phone and called the number at the bottom of the letter. It rang 4 times before a sharp voice answered. Whispering Pines, HOA, Deborah Patterson speaking. Ms. Patterson, this is Ethan Gallagher. I just received your letter about my bison. Oh, Mr. Gallagher. Her tone turned even colder. I'm glad you called. I assume you'll be making arrangements to remove those creatures immediately? Actually, I'm calling to understand why you think they need to be removed. I reviewed the HOA covenants before purchasing, and there's nothing that prohibits bison on properties over 2 acres. Mr. Gallagher, bison are wild animals. They're unpredictable and dangerous. We've had multiple complaints from residents who are concerned about their safety and their children's safety. I looked out my window at my herd. The 6 females were clustered near their water trough, completely relaxed. Bertha, my oldest at 8 years, was lying down and chewing cud. Madam, with all respect, bison that are raised properly are no more dangerous than cattle. They're livestock. I have proper fencing, and they've never shown any aggression. That's not the point. The HOA board has determined they pose an unacceptable risk. You signed the covenants when you purchased your home. You're bound by our decisions. I'd like to see the specific section you're citing. My copy of the covenants doesn't mention bison at all. There was a pause. The board amended the rules 6 months ago. All residents were notified by mail. I never received any amendment. I had only owned the property for 4 months. That's not our problem, Mr. Gallagher. The rules are the rules. 14 days. After that, we begin fines and can place a lien on your property. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there, anger building in my chest. I'd worked too hard and too long to let some power-hungry HOA president bully me off my own land. I called my real estate attorney, Marcus Chen, who had helped me with the purchase. Marcus listened to my story and asked me to email him the letter and any amendments the HOA claimed to have sent. This doesn't sound right, Ethan. Montana has specific laws about HOA authority, especially regarding agricultural animals. Let me do some research and get back to you. While I waited, I did what any reasonable person would do in 2025. I started researching Montana livestock laws. What I found was fascinating. Montana distinguishes between commercial livestock operations and personal livestock ownership, but in both cases, the state gives significant deference to ranchers and farmers. Bison, specifically, were classified as domestic livestock under Montana law as long as they were properly contained and registered. That last part caught my attention. Registered. I had registration papers from the breeder showing the lineage of my bison, but I didn't have them registered with the Montana Department of Livestock. I called the department and spoke with a clerk who explained that while registration wasn't mandatory for small herds on private property, it could be helpful if there were ever disputes about ownership or legal status. You might also want to talk to the brand inspector, she suggested. They handle livestock issues and can verify that your animals are properly kept and legitimate domestic livestock. Brand inspector? Yes, sir. Montana requires all cattle and bison to be inspected when they're moved or sold. Even if you're not selling, an inspector can come out and verify your herd is legal and properly maintained. It's free for the initial inspection. I thanked her and requested an inspection. They scheduled someone to come out within the week. 3 days later, Marcus called me back. Ethan, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that the amendment Deborah cited was never properly filed with the county. Montana law requires HOAs to record any covenant amendments with the county clerk. They didn't do that, which means the amendment isn't legally enforceable. And the bad news? The bad news is that even if they can't enforce this specific rule, they can still make your life miserable with other rules and fines. HOAs in Montana have a lot of power if they're willing to be petty. You might win this battle but face ongoing harassment. So what do I do? Document everything. Keep records of all your interactions with them. Make sure your bison operation is completely legal and above board. If they want to fight, make sure you're bulletproof. The next morning, I got another letter from Deborah. This one informed me that the HOA board was holding an emergency meeting to discuss the bison situation and that my presence was required. The meeting was scheduled for that Friday evening at the community center. I had never been to the Whispering Pines Community Center, a modest building that sat near the development's entrance. When I arrived at 7 o'clock, I found about 20 people already seated in a meeting room that smelled like old coffee and floor wax. Deborah stood at the front, arranging papers on a folding table. She was exactly what I expected. Mid-50s, blonde hair cut in a severe bob, wearing a pantsuit that looked too formal for a rural Montana HOA meeting. When she saw me, her expression hardened. "Mr. Gallagher, please take a seat." I sat in the back row. The other attendees were a mix of ages, mostly couples, and they kept glancing back at me and whispering. I recognized a few faces from the neighborhood, but didn't know any names. Deborah called the meeting to order and immediately launched into her agenda. "We're here tonight to address a serious safety concern. Mr. Gallagher, a resident at 4785 Meadowlark Lane, has been keeping a herd of wild bison on his property in direct violation of our community standards." A woman in the third row raised her hand. "How many bison?" "6, Deborah said, making it sound like I was running a zoo. 6 wild, unpredictable animals that could break through fences and trample our children. I raised my hand. "May I speak?" Deborah looked annoyed but nodded. I stood up. "First, they're not wild. They're domestic livestock, bred and raised for docility. Second, they're all females, which are generally calmer than males. Third, my fencing exceeds Montana Department of Livestock standards for bison containment. And fourth, I've had them for 4 months without a single incident." A man in the front row turned around. "But they could be dangerous, right? I mean, they're massive animals." "So are horses," I said. "So are cattle. Half the properties in this development have horses. Are we banning those too?" Deborah cut in. "Horses are traditional domestic animals. Bison are not. The board has determined they pose an unacceptable risk." "Based on what?" I asked. "Have any of you actually seen my bison? Have any of you consulted with livestock experts?" "We don't need to be experts to know that wild animals don't belong in a residential community," Deborah snapped. "They're not wild," I repeated, but I could see I was losing the room. People were nodding along with Deborah, fear spreading through the group like a virus. The meeting went on for another hour. Various residents stood up to express their concerns, most of which were based on complete misconceptions about bison. One woman insisted they could jump 12-foot fences. Another claimed they were aggressive during mating season, which was irrelevant since I only had females. A few people suggested I was running an illegal commercial operation, even though I had no intention of selling the animals or their meat. Through it all, Deborah orchestrated the discussion like a conductor, amplifying fears and dismissing my attempts to provide facts. When the board finally voted to uphold the ban and the fine schedule, it was unanimous. 5 board members, 5 votes to force me off my land. As people filed out, a woman in her 40s approached me. She had sat quietly through the entire meeting. "Mr. Gallagher, I'm Helen Norton. I live on Sagebrush Trail. I just wanted to say I don't think this is right. I drive past your property sometimes and your bison seem perfectly peaceful." "Thank you," I said, genuinely grateful for the support. I wish more people felt that way. "Deborah has a way of getting people worked up," Helen said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "She's been president for 3 years, and every year she finds something new to crusade about. Last year it was chicken coops. Before that, solar panels. She just likes control." "Any advice on dealing with her?" Helen shook her head. "Just don't back down. She's used to people caving to avoid the hassle, but if you stand your ground, sometimes she moves on to an easier target." I thanked her and headed home, my mind racing. The 14-day deadline was now 11 days away. The next morning, a white pickup truck pulled into my driveway. A man in his 60s climbed out, wearing Wranglers and a shirt with a Montana Department of Livestock patch on the shoulder. "Ethan Gallagher?" he asked, extending a hand. "That's me." "Frank Morrison, brand inspector. You called for an inspection?" "I did. Thanks for coming out." Frank had the weathered look of someone who had spent his entire life working with livestock. As we walked toward the pasture, I explained the situation with the HOA. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding. When we reached the fence, my bison were grazing about 50 yards away. Frank leaned against the fence and watched them for a long moment. "Nice-looking animals," he finally said. "Healthy coats, good weight. Where'd you get them?" "Breeder near Livingston. I have all the paperwork in the house." "Let's see it." I retrieved the documents, including the bill of sale, health certificates, and lineage records. Frank reviewed everything carefully, making notes on a clipboard. "Your fencing looks solid," he said. 5-strand barbed wire. Corner braces are good. You're well above the minimum requirements." He walked the fence line, checking posts and tension. My bison watched him with mild curiosity, but didn't approach. After about an hour, Frank returned to his truck and filled out several forms. "Mr. Gallagher, your operation is completely legal and properly maintained. These are domestic bison, legally purchased and humanely kept. I'm going to file a report stating that, and I'll send you a copy." "Will that help with the HOA?" Frank frowned. "Can't say for sure, but Montana law is pretty clear that HOAs can't prohibit agricultural activities that comply with state livestock regulations. Your bison comply. If they try to fine you, you've got documentation from the state that your operation is legitimate. What about the danger angle? They're claiming bison are inherently dangerous. That's nonsense. Any large animal can be dangerous if mishandled, but properly raised bison are no more aggressive than cattle. Actually, they're often calmer because they spook less easily. I've been inspecting livestock for 32 years, and I've been kicked by more cows and horses than I can count. Never once had a problem with bison." Frank handed me a copy of his report. "You might also want to document your animal's temperament. Take videos, keep records of their behavior. If this ends up in court, you'll want evidence that they're docile." After Frank left, I spent the afternoon filming my bison. I walked into the pasture with a bucket of feed, and they approached calmly, eating from my hand. I scratched Bertha behind her massive head, and she leaned into my touch like a dog. I recorded all of it, uploading the videos to a cloud storage account in case I needed them later. That evening, I received an email from Deborah. The subject line was "Final Warning," and the body was brief. "Mr. Gallagher, this is your final notice to remove the dangerous animals from your property. You have 10 days remaining. Failure to comply will result in immediate fines and legal action." I forwarded the email to Marcus, along with Frank's inspection report. He called me an hour later. "This is perfect, Ethan. The brand inspector's report gives you significant legal standing. I'm going to draft a response to Deborah citing Montana Code annotated Section 76-4-102, which specifically classifies bison as domestic livestock, and Section 81-2701, which gives the Department of Livestock authority over livestock regulations. The HOA can override state law. Can they still find me? They can try, but you won't have to pay. If they place a lien on your property, we can challenge it in court and almost certainly win. It'll be a hassle, but you're in a strong position. Marcus sent his letter the next day via certified mail. It was thorough and politely worded, but the message was clear. The HOA had no legal authority to prohibit my bison, and any attempt to find me would be met with legal action. I didn't hear anything for 3 days. I started to hope that maybe Deborah had realized she was overreaching and would back down. Then, on day 7 of my 14-day deadline, I came home from town to find 2 sheriff's deputies parked in my driveway. My heart sank. I parked next to them and got out, trying to stay calm. "Ethan Gallagher?" the first deputy asked. He was young, probably mid-20s, with a name tag that read Peterson. "That's me. Is there a problem?" The second deputy, older and heavy-set with Rodriguez on his uniform, spoke up. "We received a complaint about dangerous animals on your property. We need to take a look." "Of course. May I ask who filed the complaint?" "Anonymous call. Someone claimed you had aggressive bison that were threatening people. I led them to the back pasture." My bison were doing what they always did, grazing peacefully. Bertha was lying down again, and the others were scattered across the field, tails swishing at flies. Peterson looked at Rodriguez. "Those are the dangerous animals?" "That's my herd," I said. 6 females, all docile. I've never had any incidents." Rodriguez walked along the fence line, examining the enclosure. "This looks solid. No gaps, good height. Your animals contained?" "Always. I had a state brand inspector out here 2 days ago. He certified that my operation is legal and properly maintained." I showed them Frank's report on my phone. Both deputies read it carefully. "Mr. Gallagher," Rodriguez said, "I don't see any issue here. These animals are clearly contained and appear calm. Whoever called this in either has a personal grudge or doesn't know what they're talking about." "I have a homeowners association that's trying to force me to get rid of them," I explained. "They think bison are dangerous." Peterson shook his head. "I grew up on a ranch. Bison are livestock, same as cattle. If you're following state regulations, which it looks like you are, there's nothing we can do." They both tipped their hats and left, but the incident rattled me. Deborah was escalating. She wasn't going to let this go. The next morning, I got a text from Helen Norton. "Deborah is telling everyone at the community pool that your bison attacked a jogger. Thought you should know." I immediately texted back, "That's completely false. Should I be worried about slander?" Helen replied, "Probably. She's whipping people into a frenzy. Half the neighborhood thinks you're running a death trap." I called Marcus and told him about the false accusations. He was not amused. "That's defamation, Ethan. If she's spreading false information that damages your reputation or property value, you could have grounds for a lawsuit. But first, let's send her a cease and desist." Marcus drafted the letter that afternoon, demanding that Deborah stop making false statements about my bison and threatening legal action if she continued. He sent it certified mail and emailed a copy directly to her. Meanwhile, I decided to be proactive about the community's concerns. I typed up a letter of my own and printed 50 copies, which I hand-delivered to every house in Whispering Pines. The letter explained what bison actually were, how they were classified under Montana law, and invited anyone with concerns to visit my property and see the animals for themselves. I got exactly 2 responses. The first was from an older man named George, who said he'd worked with bison at a conservation ranch in Wyoming and thought what I was doing was great. The second was from a couple with young kids who took me up on the offer to visit. The Hendersons showed up on a Saturday morning with their 2 children, both under 10. I met them at the gate and walked them to the pasture. "This is amazing," Mrs. Henderson said, watching the bison through the fence. "They're so much bigger than I expected." "Can we pet them?" the younger child asked. "Not through the fence, but I can call them over and you can see them up close." I rattled the feed bucket, and 3 of my bison ambled over. The kids were mesmerized, staring wide-eyed at the massive animals. Bertha let me scratch her head, and I explained how bison behavior worked, how to read their body language, and why they were actually quite gentle when properly handled. "I can't believe Deborah is making such a big deal about this," Mr. Henderson said. "These animals are incredible, and you're clearly taking good care of them." "I appreciate that," I said. If you wouldn't mind telling other neighbors, it might help calm some of the fear. They promised they would, but I doubted it would make much difference. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Deborah had spent weeks stoking it. The 14-day deadline arrived. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, I received a certified letter informing me that I was now in violation of HOA covenants and subject to a $500 daily fine effective immediately. The letter also stated that the HOA was filing a lien against my property for the initial $10,000 penalty. I forwarded everything to Marcus. He called me an hour later, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. They're really doing this. Okay, we need to file a complaint in district court. We'll seek an injunction to prevent them from enforcing the fines and a declaratory judgment that the HOA rules are invalid as applied to your Bison. This is going to take time and money, Ethan. Are you prepared for that? I am. I'm not letting them win this. Good. I'll start drafting the paperwork today. Over the next week, the situation got worse. Someone spray-painted Bison Killer on my mailbox. I received anonymous letters calling me selfish and dangerous. Twice, I found nails scattered across my driveway. I installed security cameras around my property and filed a report with the sheriff's office about the vandalism. Deputy Rodriguez came out to take my statement. This is harassment, Mr. Gallagher. We'll increase patrols in your area, but without catching someone in the act, there's not much we can do. I know who's behind it, I said, or at least who's encouraging it. The HOA president? Yeah, Deborah Patterson. Rodriguez sighed. HOA disputes are ugly. People get crazy when they think their property values are threatened. Just keep documenting everything and stay safe. Marcus filed our lawsuit 2 weeks later. The complaint was thorough, citing Montana's livestock laws, the HOA's failure to properly file their covenant amendments, and the fact that my Bison operation complied with all state regulations. We attached Frank Morrison's inspection report, veterinary records from my Bison, and photos of my fencing and property. The HOA filed a response a week after that, and it was aggressive. Their attorney argued that HOAs had broad authority to regulate property use, that Bison were inherently dangerous regardless of state classification, and that my operation violated the spirit of the community standards even if it didn't violate the letter of the law. Reading their response made my blood boil. They were essentially arguing that public perception trumped legal reality. The judge scheduled a hearing for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the harassment continued. Someone cut my fence one night, and 2 of my Bison wandered onto the road. Fortunately, I discovered it early in the morning before there was any traffic, and I was able to herd them back into the pasture. But it scared me. If one of them had been hit by a car, I would have been devastated, and the HOA would have used it as ammunition. I upgraded my security system, adding motion sensor lights and more cameras. I also started sleeping lighter, waking up several times a night to check on the herd. Helen Norton called me one evening. Ethan, I need to tell you something. Deborah is planning to pack the courtroom with residents to make it look like the whole community is against you. She's been calling people and organizing carpools. Great, a show trial. I'm going to be there too, Helen said, and I'm bringing a few other people who think this whole thing is ridiculous. You're not alone. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I wore a suit and tie, feeling out of place but wanting to look professional. Marcus met me outside the courthouse carrying a briefcase stuffed with documents. How are you feeling? He asked. Like I'm fighting for my life. In a way, you are. This property and those Bison represent your retirement dream. We're not going to let them take it from you. The courtroom was exactly as Helen had warned, packed with Whispering Pines residents. Deborah sat in the front row behind the HOA's attorney, a slick-looking man in his 40s named Richard Brennan. She looked confident, almost triumphant. Helen was there too, 3 rows back, along with George and the Hendersons. Seeing friendly faces helped. Judge Patricia Walsh entered, and we all stood. She was in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and a no-nonsense expression. Please be seated. We're here today for Gallagher versus Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. This is a hearing on the plaintiff's motion for injunctive relief and declaratory judgment. Mr. Chen, you may proceed. Marcus stood and approached the podium. Your Honor, This case is straightforward. My client, Ethan Gallagher, owns a 5-acre property in Whispering Pines where he keeps 6 domestic bison in compliance with all Montana livestock regulations. The HOA is attempting to prohibit this legal agricultural activity based on unsupported claims that bison are dangerous. Montana law is clear. Bison are classified as domestic livestock, and HOAs cannot override state livestock regulations. He walked through our arguments methodically, citing statutes and case law. He entered Frank Morrison's inspection report into evidence, along with veterinary records and videos of me interacting with my bison. Then it was Brennan's turn. He stood and immediately went for emotional appeal. Your Honor, this case is about community safety. Mr. Gallagher may believe his bison are safe, but the residents of Whispering Pines live in fear. Children play in yards adjacent to his property. Joggers run past his fence. These are wild animals, unpredictable and dangerous, and the Homeowners Association has a duty to protect its residents. Mr. Brennan, Judge Walsh interrupted, are you arguing that the HOA's authority supersedes state law? We're arguing that the HOA has the right to establish reasonable safety standards within its community. But bison are classified as domestic livestock under Montana Code Annotated. Do you dispute that classification? Brennan hesitated. We believe that classification is overly broad and doesn't account for the realities of keeping such animals in a residential setting. Judge Walsh raised an eyebrow. Are you asking this court to rewrite Montana livestock law? Of course not, Your Honor. We're simply asking the court to recognize the HOA's legitimate concerns and uphold its authority to regulate property use. Do you have any evidence that Mr. Gallagher's bison have behaved aggressively or escaped their enclosure? Another hesitation. There was an incident where 2 bison were found on the road. Mr. Chen, the judge asked. Marcus stood. Your Honor, that incident occurred after someone cut my client's fence in the middle of the night. It was vandalism, not a failure of containment. Mr. Gallagher reported it to the sheriff's office, and there's an ongoing investigation. Judge Walsh made a note. Mr. Brennan, besides that incident, which appears to have been caused by criminal activity, do you have any evidence of danger? The potential for danger is evident, Your Honor. Bison are massive animals. If one were to become aggressive or escape, the consequences could be catastrophic. The same could be said of horses, which are kept throughout this community. Is the HOA planning to ban horses as well? Horses are traditional domestic animals. So are bison, according to Montana law. Do you have any expert testimony to support your position that bison are more dangerous than horses or cattle? Brennan looked uncomfortable. We have affidavits from concerned residents. I'm asking about expert testimony. Veterinarians, livestock specialists, anyone with actual knowledge of bison behavior. No, Your Honor. Judge Walsh leaned back in her chair. Mr. Chen, I assume you do have expert testimony. Yes, Your Honor. We have the report from Frank Morrison, a Montana brand inspector with over 30 years of experience. He personally inspected Mr. Gallagher's operation and found it to be completely compliant with state standards. He also stated that properly raised bison are no more dangerous than cattle. The judge reviewed the report, taking her time. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional cough or shifting in seats. Finally, Judge Walsh spoke. I'm going to rule from the bench. This court finds that Mr. Gallagher's bison operation complies with all applicable Montana livestock regulations. The Montana Department of Livestock has jurisdiction over such matters, and a state brand inspector has certified that the operation is safe and legal. The HOA's attempted prohibition is an overreach of its authority and is preempted by state law. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Furthermore, the judge continued, the HOA's covenant amendment was never properly recorded with the county clerk as required by Montana law. Therefore, it is not enforceable. The court grants the plaintiff's motion for injunctive relief. The HOA is prohibited from fining Mr. Gallagher or placing any liens on his property related to his bison. Additionally, the court declares that Mr. Gallagher has the legal right to keep domestic bison on his property in accordance with state law. Deborah stood up. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Those animals are a danger to our community." Judge Walsh fixed her with a stern look. "Madam, please sit down. This court has ruled based on the evidence and applicable law. If you have concerns about livestock regulations in Montana, you're welcome to petition the state legislature, but you cannot use HOA covenants to override state law. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel came down, and it was over. Marcus shook my hand, grinning. "We did it." Helen rushed over and hugged me. "Congratulations, Ethan." Deborah stormed out of the courtroom, her face red with anger. Several residents followed her, shooting me dirty looks, but others stayed behind to congratulate me, including a few people I had never met who said they were relieved the HOA's overreach had been checked. As we left the courthouse, Marcus pulled me aside. "Ethan, you should know that this probably isn't over. Deborah strikes me as someone who holds grudges. She might try to make your life difficult in other ways." "I'll deal with it," I said. "Right now, I just want to go home and check on my herd." The bison were fine, of course, grazing in the afternoon sun. I stood at the fence and watched them for a long time, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I had stood my ground and won. But Marcus was right. It wasn't over. 2 weeks after the hearing, I received a notice that the HOA was conducting a property standards inspection of my home. According to the letter, they would be checking for violations of the covenants, including landscaping, exterior paint, and maintenance issues. It was clearly retaliation, but I couldn't stop them. The covenants allowed for annual inspections, and this would be the first since I had bought the property. The inspector showed up on a Monday morning. He was a nervous-looking man in his 30s who clearly didn't want to be there. He walked around my property with a clipboard, taking photos and making notes. "Everything looks fine to me," he finally said. "Your landscaping is neat. The house is well maintained. I don't see any violations." "So we're good." "As far as I can tell. But I have to submit my report to the board. They'll make the final determination." A week later, I received a citation for 17 different violations, ranging from grass exceeding acceptable height to improper fence staining to unapproved exterior lighting. Each violation carried a $100 fine. I took photos of everything they cited and sent them to Marcus. "This is harassment," I wrote. "My grass is 3 inches tall, which is well within the acceptable range. My fence is the natural wood color it was when I bought the place, and the exterior lighting is standard motion sensor security lights." Marcus reviewed the citations and agreed. "They're inventing violations. We can challenge these, but it's going to cost you legal fees every time. They're trying to bleed you dry." "So what do I do?" "Document everything. Take photos with timestamps. Get statements from neighbors about the condition of your property, and let's file a formal complaint against the HOA for harassment." I spent the next several days gathering evidence. Helen Norton walked my property with me and signed a statement saying everything looked well maintained. George did the same. I took dozens of photos and measured my grass height in multiple locations. Everything was within the HOA's published standards. Marcus sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA board, pointing out that their citations were baseless and constituted harassment in retaliation for my successful lawsuit. He demanded they withdraw the fines and warned that continued harassment would result in another legal action. The HOA responded by doubling down. They sent me a new letter stating that I had failed to correct the violations and that the fines were now increasing to $200 each, with an additional $50 per day until the issues were resolved. I was furious. This was clearly a vendetta, and Deborah was willing to abuse her power to get revenge. Marcus filed a second lawsuit, this time specifically for harassment and abuse of power. We argued that the HOA was retaliating against me for exercising my legal rights, and that their manufactured violations were an attempt to financially coerce me into leaving the community. This lawsuit moved faster than the first. Judge Walsh, who was assigned to the case again, seemed annoyed that the HOA hadn't learned its lesson from the first ruling. The hearing was brief. Marcus presented our evidence of the bogus violations, and the HOA's attorney struggled to defend them. When Judge Walsh asked for photos showing the supposed violations, Brennan admitted they didn't have any beyond the inspector's report. "So you're fining Mr. Gallagher based solely on an inspector's notes, without photographic evidence?" the judge asked. "The inspector's report is sufficient documentation, Your Honor." Not when the supposed violations are subjective assessments like excessive grass height. Where are the measurements? Where are the photos proving the grass exceeded HOA standards? Brennan shuffled through his papers. We'll need to obtain those. You should have obtained them before issuing fines. This court finds that the HOA has failed to meet its burden of proof. The fines are vacated, and the HOA is ordered to cease any further retaliatory actions against Mr. Gallagher. If this court sees another case involving this HOA and this plaintiff, I will seriously consider sanctions. It was another victory, but the stress was taking its toll. I had spent thousands of dollars on legal fees, and the constant conflict was exhausting. I loved my property and my bison, but I was starting to wonder if it was worth it. Then, something unexpected happened. A reporter from the Bozeman Daily Chronicle called me. Her name was Sarah, and she had heard about my legal battles from someone in the courthouse. Mr. Gallagher, I'm working on a story about HOA overreach in Montana. Your case is fascinating. Would you be willing to talk to me? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to stay out of the spotlight, but another part wanted to expose what Deborah had been doing. I'll talk to you, I said. Sarah came out to my property the next day. She interviewed me for over an hour, asking about the bison, the HOA, and the legal battles. She also asked to see the animals, and I walked her through the pasture. She took photos of me with Bertha and the rest of the herd. These animals are so calm, she said, clearly surprised. I don't understand why anyone would think they're dangerous. Fear and misinformation, I said. Once someone decides something is scary, it's hard to change their mind. The article ran a week later on the front page of the local section. It was fair and well-researched, detailing the legal battles and quoting both me and Deborah. But it also included a statement from Frank Morrison, the brand inspector, who reiterated that my operation was completely legal and safe. The article sparked a wave of support. I received dozens of emails and phone calls from people around Montana who had faced similar HOA disputes or who supported property rights. A few local news stations picked up the story, and suddenly I was doing interviews on television. The publicity embarrassed the HOA. At their next board meeting, which Helen attended and reported back to me, several members expressed concern about the negative attention. One board member even suggested that Deborah had gone too far and should resign. Deborah refused, of course. But the tide was turning. Then, about a month after the article ran, I got a call from the Montana Attorney General's office. A lawyer named Jennifer explained that they were investigating the Whispering Pines HOA for potential violations of Montana's HOA laws. We've received multiple complaints about improper covenant amendments, failure to follow proper filing procedures, and retaliatory fines, Jennifer said. Your case brought these issues to our attention, but you're not the only one who's had problems with this HOA. What happens now? We're conducting a formal investigation. If we find violations, we can impose fines on the HOA and require them to reform their practices. In extreme cases, we can petition a court to dissolve the board and require new elections. This was bigger than I had imagined. My fight with Deborah had opened the door to a broader examination of the HOA's practices. Over the next several months, the Attorney General's investigation uncovered a pattern of misconduct. Deborah had been amending HOA rules without proper board votes, failing to file required documents with the county, and using her position to target residents she personally disliked. My case was just the most visible example. The Attorney General's office issued a scathing report and fined the HOA $15,000 for violations of Montana HOA statutes. They also mandated that the board hold new elections within 60 days, and that Deborah was prohibited from serving on the board for 5 years. When the election was held, Helen Norton ran for president. She won easily, along with several other candidates who promised to reform the HOA and focus on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. At Helen's first board meeting as president, she introduced a motion to formally recognize residents' rights to keep domestic livestock in accordance with Montana law. It passed unanimously. I attended that meeting, and afterward, Helen pulled me aside. I want to thank you, Ethan. If you hadn't stood your ground, Deborah would still be running this HOA like her personal fiefdom. You did the whole community a service. I just wanted to keep my bison, I said. And you did. But you also showed everyone that HOAs aren't above the law. That matters. A few weeks later, I was working on repairs to my barn when I saw a familiar white pickup truck coming up my driveway. Frank Morrison climbed out, waving. "Frank, good to see you. What brings you out here?" "Just in the area and thought I'd check on your herd. Plus, I heard you've been having quite the adventure with your HOA." "You could say that, but it's finally over. New board, new attitude." We walked to the pasture together. My bison were thriving. I had added 2 more females to the herd, bringing the total to 8. Bertha was still the matriarch, and she ambled over when she saw Frank. "She remembers you," I said. Frank scratched her behind the ears. "Bison have good memories. You're doing a great job with them, Ethan. This is one of the nicest small herds I've seen." "Thanks, it's been a learning experience." "More than you bargained for, I imagine." "Definitely, but I wouldn't change it. This is exactly where I want to be." Frank smiled. "That's good. Montana needs more people like you. People who understand the land and respect the animals." After Frank left, I spent the rest of the afternoon with my bison. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The herd grazed peacefully, their dark forms silhouetted against the grass. I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. The conflict with Deborah, the legal battles, the harassment and vandalism. It had been difficult and stressful, but I had learned something important. Standing up for what's right matters, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Gallagher, this is Thomas Brenner. I live in Whispering Pines, and I've been thinking about getting some bison of my own. Would you be willing to talk to me about it?" I smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. Come by any time." As I looked out at my herd, I realized that my fight had done more than protect my own property rights. It had opened the door for others who wanted to live a similar lifestyle, and it had reminded a community that freedom and property rights weren't just abstract concepts, but real things worth defending. The weeks turned into months, and life in Whispering Pines settled into a comfortable rhythm. The new HOA board focused on actual community improvements, organizing neighborhood barbecues, maintaining common areas, and mediating disputes fairly. Helen proved to be an excellent president, approachable and reasonable. Thomas Brenner did come by, and I spent hours talking to him about bison husbandry. He ended up purchasing a small herd of his own, and we became friends, sharing tips and occasionally helping each other with maintenance and care. The Hendersons brought their kids by regularly. The children were fascinated by the bison and loved watching them. Mrs. Henderson even asked if she could bring her daughter's class on a field trip. I agreed, and soon I was hosting groups of elementary school kids, teaching them about bison conservation and Montana's ranching heritage. Deborah Patterson left Whispering Pines about 6 months after losing her position on the board. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to a condo in Billings where there was no HOA at all. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. One afternoon in late spring, I was repairing a section of fence when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A woman in her 30s got out, dressed in business casual attire. "Mr. Gallagher?" she called. That's me. Can I help you?" "My name is Rebecca Palmer. I'm with the Montana Bison Association. We're a nonprofit that promotes bison conservation and supports bison ranchers throughout the state. I read about your situation in the news, and I wanted to reach out." "Nice to meet you. What can I do for you?" "Actually, I'm here to see what we can do for you. The MBA offers resources for bison owners, including veterinary support, marketing assistance if you ever want to sell meat or breeding stock, and educational programs. We'd love to have you as a member." She handed me a brochure. I flipped through it, impressed by the range of services they offered. "This looks great," I said. "I'm not planning to go commercial, but having access to resources would be helpful. We work with hobbyists and small-scale ranchers, too. In fact, we're always looking for people willing to do educational outreach. Your story resonated with a lot of people. Would you ever consider speaking at schools or community events about bison and property rights?" I hadn't thought about it, but the idea appealed to me. I'd be open to it. Rebecca and I talked for another hour. She toured my property, met my bison, and shared information about upcoming MBA events. By the time she left, I had signed up for a membership and agreed to participate in a panel discussion at the Montana Agriculture Conference in the fall. The conference was held in Great Falls, and I drove up with a mix of nervousness and excitement. The panel was titled Property Rights in Livestock: Navigating Legal Challenges, and I was joined by two other ranchers who had faced their own battles with local governments and HOAs. The room was packed with farmers, ranchers, and landowners. When it was my turn to speak, I told my story as clearly and honestly as I could. I talked about the initial conflict with Deborah, the importance of Frank Morrison's inspection report, and the legal battles that followed. I emphasized the role of Montana's livestock laws in protecting my rights and encouraged everyone to know their legal standing before conflicts escalated. During the question and answer session, a middle-aged man stood up. "Mr. Gallagher, did you ever regret buying property in an HOA community?" It was a fair question. "Sometimes," I admitted. "There were moments when I wondered if it was worth the stress. But ultimately, I'm glad I fought. If I had given up, it would have set a precedent that HOAs could override state law whenever they felt like it. That's dangerous for everyone." Another person asked, "What advice would you give to someone facing a similar situation?" "Document everything, know the law, get expert opinions like brand inspectors or veterinarians to back up your position, and find a good attorney who understands property and livestock law." I couldn't have won without Marcus Chen on my side. After the panel, several people came up to thank me and share their own stories. Some had dealt with HOAs, others with county zoning boards or state regulations. The common thread was that standing up for property rights was almost always worth it, even when it was difficult. As I drove home that evening, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. My retirement plan had been simple: buy land, raise bison, and enjoy the peace of rural Montana. I hadn't planned on becoming an advocate for property rights or getting involved in legal battles, but life has a way of pushing you in unexpected directions. Back at home, I found Helen Norton sitting on my porch. She had a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Heard you were at the agriculture conference," she said. "Thought you might want to celebrate your new career as a public speaker." I laughed. I don't know about a career, but it was an interesting experience. We sat on the porch, watching the sunset over the mountains. My bison were settling down for the evening, and the air was filled with the sounds of crickets and distant birdsong. "You know," Helen said, "when you first moved here and I heard about the bison, I thought you were crazy. Not because of the animals, but because I knew Deborah would go after you, and she did." "Yeah, she did. But you didn't back down. And because of that, this community is better. We have a functional HOA now, one that actually serves the residents instead of terrorizing them. That's because of you." "It's because of a lot of people," I said. "You, Marcus, Frank Morrison, even Judge Walsh. I couldn't have done it alone." "Maybe. But you were the one who stood in the middle of the storm. That takes courage." We finished the wine and talked about mundane things: plans for the upcoming summer, ideas for community events, and gossip about various neighbors. It was comfortable and easy, the kind of friendship that forms when people have been through something difficult together. The next morning, I woke early and headed out to feed my bison. It was a routine I loved, the quiet of the early morning broken only by the sound of their hooves on the grass and their low, rumbling calls. Bertha was always first to the feed trough, asserting her dominance with gentle but firm nudges to the younger females. As I watched them eat, I thought about how much had changed in a year and a half. I had gone from being a newcomer trying to stay under the radar to becoming a minor public figure in Montana's ranching community. My legal battles had been chronicled in newspapers and discussed at conferences, and my peaceful bison herd had become symbols of something larger: the right of people to live according to their values on their own land. A few months later, I received a call from a law professor at the University of Montana. She was teaching a course on property law and asked if I would be willing to come speak to her class about my experience. "I think your case is an excellent example of the tension between private covenants and state regulatory authority," she said. "It's exactly the kind of real-world application my students need to see." I agreed, and a few weeks later, I found myself standing in front of 60 law students, telling my story once again. This time, I focused more on the legal strategies Marcus had used and the specific statutes that had been critical to our success. The students asked sharp, probing questions. One young woman wanted to know if I thought HOAs served any useful purpose. Absolutely, I said. When they're run properly, HOAs can maintain property values, organize community activities, and handle shared resources. The problem is when they're controlled by people who abuse their power, or when boards forget that they serve the residents, not the other way around. Another student asked about the personal toll of the legal battle. I paused before answering. It was exhausting and expensive. There were times I wanted to give up, but I kept thinking about what would happen if I did. Deborah would have won, and the next person she targeted would face the same abuse. Sometimes you have to fight, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Teaching that class was one of the most rewarding experiences I had had since moving to Montana. When I left, several students thanked me and said they were inspired by the idea of using law to protect people's rights. As summer arrived, my bison herd grew again. I purchased 2 more females from a breeder in South Dakota, bringing my total to 10. The pasture could comfortably handle 15, so I had room to expand if I wanted. But 10 felt right for now, a manageable herd that I could care for without help. Thomas Brenner and I started coordinating our herds, occasionally breeding his bull with my females to maintain genetic diversity. We both wanted to contribute to bison conservation in our own small way, and quality breeding was part of that mission. One Saturday in July, the Whispering Pines HOA hosted a community picnic at the park near the development's entrance. Helen had invited me personally, and I decided to go, curious to see how people would react. When I arrived, I was surprised by the warm reception. People I had never met came up to introduce themselves and thank me for challenging the old board. Several said they had been on the receiving end of Deborah's harassment and were grateful someone had finally stood up to her. George, the older man who had supported me from the beginning, clinked his beer bottle against mine. "You did good, kid. Whispering Pines is a better place because of you." "Thanks, George. I appreciate your support through all of it. Anytime. You need anything, you just holler." The Hendersons were there with their kids, who immediately dragged me over to the playground to tell me about a school project they had done on bison. Apparently, their teacher had been so impressed that she was planning an entire unit on Montana wildlife for the fall. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't since moving to Whispering Pines. The community finally felt like a community, not a battleground. People were friendly and welcoming, and the HOA was just a background presence managing practical things like snow removal and park maintenance. Helen gave a short speech, thanking everyone for coming and highlighting some upcoming projects: a new playground, improvements to the community center, and a fall festival. She also took a moment to address the past. "I know the last couple of years haven't been easy for everyone. There was a lot of conflict and division, but I think we've learned from that experience. This HOA exists to serve you, the residents. If you ever feel like we're overstepping or making decisions that don't reflect your values, please speak up. Communication and transparency are how we avoid repeating past mistakes." There was applause, and someone shouted, "No more bison bans!" People laughed, and I raised my beer in acknowledgement. After the picnic, Helen walked with me to my truck. "You seemed more relaxed today." "I am. This felt like a real community event, not a political demonstration." "That's what I was hoping for. We're moving forward. The bad days are behind us." "I hope so." "They are. Trust me." As I drove home, I reflected on how much had changed. The anger and fear that had defined my first year in Whispering Pines had been replaced by something better: a sense of belonging. I wasn't the outsider with dangerous animals anymore. I was just Ethan, the guy with the bison who had stood up for his rights and helped reform the HOA in the process. Over the next year, life continued to improve. My bison herd remained healthy, and I became more skilled at managing their care. I joined several bison conservation organizations and even contributed to a genetic diversity program that tracked lineages across the country. The Montana Bison Association invited me to join their board of directors, and I accepted. It was a volunteer position, but it allowed me to help shape policies and programs that supported bison ranchers throughout the state. I found the work fulfilling, a way to give back to a community that had supported me during my darkest days. Marcus Chen and I stayed in touch. He occasionally sent me articles about HOA cases in other states, many of which echoed the issues I had faced. "You started something," he told me during one phone call. "People are paying more attention to HOA overreach. Your case gets cited in legal briefs all over the country now." "I didn't set out to be a test case," I said. "No, but you became one. And you won. That matters." Frank Morrison stopped by periodically to check on my herd and share stories from his inspections around Montana. We became friends, bonding over our shared love of the land and the animals that inhabited it. He was nearing retirement himself and talked about buying a small ranch where he could raise bison in his golden years. "You inspired me," he said one afternoon as we watched my herd graze. "Seeing what you've built here, it made me realize I want the same thing. Just me, some land, and a few bison. Peace and quiet." "It's a good life," I said. "Just be prepared for the occasional HOA battle." Frank laughed. "I'll make sure to buy property without an HOA." As winter approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. 2 years ago, I'd been a construction worker in Seattle, dreaming of a different life. Now I was a bison rancher, a property rights advocate, and a respected member of the Montana ranching community. It wasn't the path I had planned, but it was better than anything I could have imagined. One cold December evening, I stood in my pasture with Bertha. She had become my constant companion, the matriarch of the herd and my favorite animal. I scratched behind her ears and she leaned into me, her warm breath visible in the freezing air. "We made it, girl," I said quietly. "We stood our ground, and we won." She rumbled softly, a sound of contentment. In the distance, the lights of whispering pines twinkled against the dark Montana night. It was home now, truly home. And my bison, once the source of so much conflict, were now just part of the landscape, accepted and even celebrated by the community. I thought about Deborah Patterson occasionally, usually with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. She had been so determined to control everything that she had lost sight of what mattered, building a community where people could live according to their values. Her fear and rigidity had been her downfall, and in the end, she had achieved the opposite of what she intended. Instead of driving me out, she had galvanized a movement for reform that had transformed Whispering Pines into a better place. The legal battles were over. The harassment had stopped, and my bison herd was thriving. I had achieved what I set out to do, live peacefully on my own land, raising animals I loved in a place that honored both freedom and community. As I walked back to the house that night, snow beginning to fall softly around me, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the people who had supported me, for the laws that protected my rights, and for the bison that had taught me the value of standing firm in the face of adversity. My retirement dream had been tested, challenged, and nearly destroyed, but it had survived, and in surviving, it had become something even more meaningful, proof that ordinary people could stand up to unjust authority and win. The snow fell harder, covering the pasture in a blanket of white. My bison settled down for the night, their dark forms barely visible in the storm. Inside the house, the fire crackled in the wood stove, and my dog Max waited by the door. I kicked off my boots and poured a glass of whiskey, toasting silently to the journey that had brought me here. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, and new opportunities to protect the life I had built. But tonight, I was content. Montana had given me more than I had hoped for. It had given me a home, a purpose, and the strength to fight for what mattered. And my bison, those magnificent animals that Deborah had called dangerous, had been the catalyst for it all. As I sat by the fire, I thought about all the people who had played a role in this story. Helen Norton, who had become a friend and ally. Marcus Chen, whose legal expertise had been invaluable. Frank Morrison, whose inspection report had been the turning point. And even Judge Walsh, whose rulings had affirmed that justice still existed. But most of all, I thought about the other people out there who might be facing similar battles. People whose HOAs were overreaching, who were being told they couldn't live according to their values on their own land. I hoped my story would reach them and give them the courage to stand up and fight. Because in the end, that was what this had all been about: the right to live freely, to pursue your dreams, and to resist those who would abuse their authority to control you. It was a simple principle, but one worth defending. The fire burned low, and I refilled my glass. Outside, the storm continued, blanketing Montana in snow. But inside, I was warm and safe, surrounded by the peace I had fought so hard to achieve. My bison were out there in the cold, but they didn't mind. They were built for this climate, their thick coats insulating them from the worst of the winter weather. In the morning, I would go out and check on them, break the ice on their water trough, and throw out some hay. It was a routine I never tired of, a connection to the land and the animals that gave my life meaning. As I finally headed to bed, I paused at the window and looked out at the pasture. I could barely see the bison through the snow, but I knew they were there, safe and content. And I knew that no HOA, no matter how determined, would ever take them from me again. Montana had tested me, but it had also rewarded me. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that I had made the right choice in coming here, in buying this land, and in standing up for my rights. The journey had been difficult, but it had been worth it, every single moment.